Calvin Coolidge, who would become president of the United States after the death of Warren G. Harding, would famously say, "The chief business of the American people is business." And the economic growth during this time felt dramatic. Business and government were never as close as before during this time. The post-war recession after World War I is over by the end of 1922, and between 22 and 29, the economy booms. It booms in sectors like chemicals, aviation, electronics, food processing, and appliances. But when we have an economic boom, and we'll talk about these throughout history, there's always going to be one or two sectors of the economy, one or two products and its surrounding goods that will be the driver of that boom. In this case, it's going to be the automobile. Uh, the number of cars on the road tripled in the 1920s, going from 1.5 million to 4.8 million by the end of the decade. General Motors passes Ford when they introduce different lines of cars, where you have like an entry level for people who don't have much money, mid level, and then a luxury model. GM really pioneers this idea. Ford had really only made the Model T, and they focused on different styles. The cars weren't terribly substantially different. It was almost more of a status thing. If you had money, you bought this one to show people that you had money. By 1929, about half of American families have cars. And of course, the car industry is not by itself. It's closely related to the steel, rubber, oil, the road industry, and the construction industry, particularly the suburbs, because now that people have cars, they can afford to, it's possible to live further away from where they work, leading to the growth of the suburbs. It also, of course, spurs the tourism industry. U.S. corporations will also top international investors around the world, and the dollar displaces the pound as the primary currency in the world. America makes 85% of cars and 40% of manufactured goods in the world at the time. General Electric and International Telephone and Technology buy up their foreign competitors. IBM dominates global office supplies. American corporations buy up raw materials. The new colonialism. Now it's about buying raw materials from a place you used to might have made a colony. For example, the Ford Motor Company, wanting to gain control of the rubber supply for their tires, buys a massive piece of land in Brazil and tries to create Fordlandia, a company town in Brazil where the rubber trees grow. This is a failure. Back to the car real quick so I can address some things on these slides. The car also changes how people's lives work. As I mentioned before, now you can live further from home. You can live in the suburbs. People can spread out a little bit if they have the means, of course. But it also creates a level of freedom that isn't really there before. The ability to get in a car and get away from other people is really a remarkable thing. And, for people who have been living in incredibly densely packed cities and tenements, the car really represents freedom in so many ways. It is really also a revolution in dating. In fact, one of the terrible, rapey nicknames for automobiles at the time were struggle buggies, with all of the implications of that. But getting in a car and driving off with a boy, if you were a young girl, was a racy, exciting thing to do, and also something a bit of a dangerous and scandalous thing to do. And this fueled a lot of fantasies. As you can see in that super creepy magazine, you got this older guy being flagged down by this attractive young woman in your car, a magazine of romance, fact, and fiction, which was just a magazine that collected these sorts of stories and ideas. But the car is going to change the way our lives live. You might have had this experience yourself whenever maybe perhaps you got your license in a car, how that changed your life and what you're able to do. I certainly did back in the 80s. This is this is all part of consumption, which becomes increasingly a way of life in America. Now, Americans hadn't, and people in the world generally, had not been used to buying a lot of things. When you're on a farm, you would only make a handful of purchases a year, and they would only be things that you couldn't make on the farm, like maybe something made of steel, like an axe or something, or a rifle. You would make the other things yourself. So Americans actually had to be taught to buy things, and in order to do this, we get advertising. Let's talk about the psychology of advertising. Advertising, the first thing it has to do is convince you that you are unhappy. That is step one in advertising. Because if you are happy, if you're content, if you're sated, you have no need to spend money. So advertising starts by telling you you're unhappy. Something's missing in your life. Why aren't you running around with people this attractive? Why don't you look this stylish? Why aren't you getting this attention? Whatever. And this is true of advertising today. And then they tell you have a problem, and then they offer you a solution. Now, advertising heavily revolves around sex and fantasies about sex and attractiveness. But let me give you an example on how advertising creates this hole in you and then offers to fill it. There was a man named Joseph Lister, who was a doctor. And back then they had figured out germ theory. And so they knew they had to sterilize their instruments. And so they would take tubs of alcohol and they would soak the instruments in them. But of course, it made everywhere there were doctors smell like alcohol, which a lot of people didn't like. So one of his nurses put mint leaves in the alcohol, and now it smelled like minty alcohol, which was better. And this became quite popular. And so soon hospitals all over the country were buying this mint-scented alcohol to sterilize their stuff. But being a corporation, once they were selling to all the doctors, they still continued to want to grow and make more and more profit. And so they got together and started asking themselves, how can we get people to buy this beyond hospitals and doctors' offices? And so what the advertising company did was they came up with a disease called chronic halitosis, which is just bad breath. This isn't actually a disease. They just told you it was a disease through advertising. And the cure to chronic halitosis, to bad breath, was their product, mint-scented alcohol that they called Listerine, after Dr. Lister. And they ran in a series of ads with a man named Herman, who apparently had bad breath and nobody wanted to be around him. He couldn't get a date. His grandmother won't hang around him, to try to create this shame in you. Like, I wonder if I have bad breath. But if you did, it was okay because they had the answer. They had the product to sell you to fix that problem. All of this works. Consumer consumption just absolutely shoots through the roof. So much so, people want more stuff than they can possibly actually pay for, and they turn to credit to buy these things. And Americans begin to sink deeper and deeper into debt in an attempt to participate in the consumer economy. We also get all new sorts of inventions that become increasingly regular in the household. Telephones, washing machines, vacuums, refrigerators. This, by the way, that's a washing machine. That lady's up there on the top right. If you don't recognize that, it just doesn't have the casing around it. This, of course, is bad for domestic servants. But, generally speaking, great for the people who are responsible for doing housework otherwise. Coke was sold as an alternative to alcohol. An advertising man said the Coca-Cola campaign was impossible for consumers to escape. With this increased revenue, more and more money was spent on leisure. Vacations, movies, sports are all way up in terms of how much money they're bringing in. By 1929, 80 million Americans a week go to the movies. A week, not a year. Now, this is in a country that's probably somewhere at that point, I'm kind of guessing here, about 130 million people. Most people were going to the movies every week. Movies were made everywhere until the middle of the teens, and then the industry moves to Los Angeles, which had a much better climate and, of course, a variety of different sceneries to shoot in. In 1910, 2 French studios made most of the movies made. By 1925, America makes 8 movies to every 1 France makes. And soon, the French studios that had really started this industry have become distributors for U.S. films. They also, by the way, went to movies in these movie palaces. There would be one screen, no multiplexes, and they would be beautiful. They would be decorated like this. People would dress up to go to the movies. This was an event, kind of like if you went to a play or the ballet or something today. It was a different experience at the time. Another fun thing about this is movies didn't have start and end times back then. The movie theater would just open and they would start the movie. You didn't know when it began or ended. And people would just show up, start watching the movie from wherever it was, and then wait till it ended, watch from the beginning to wherever they came in and leave. So they wouldn't even watch the movies, from beginning to end, as we would expect to now. There's 5 million radios in America by 1929, which fuels a national celebrity culture. As between the films and the radio, we're getting famous people. A few notes on the radio. The radio, everyone had a radio who could afford one. Even in areas without electricity, they would get radios and then hook them up to car batteries. This is how common the radio was. The radio was the internet or the television of the 1920s. 2 other things. The radio was a communal experience. Today, when you think about listening to things, whether it's music or a podcast or videos or something, you probably have headphones and you're listening by yourself. That was not the way it was until really the 1990s. Everybody listened to the radio together. And maybe my favorite thing about listening to the radio back then is, and lots of people have confirmed this is true, everybody stared at the radio when they listened to it. You would think with the radio, one of the advantages would be you could go do other things and it would just be in the background. But no, they tended to sit around and look at it, waiting for television, I guess. Also, radio was not what you think of it as today. Radio was a lot of acted out, scripted dramas. Radio, and there you see the sound people there who would make the gunshots and the footsteps and stuff. The most popular thing on radio was actually ministers, actually preaching. These were the biggest figures on the radio. Music, if it was played on the radio in the 1920s, was almost certainly going to be played by a live band. This is because record labels saw the radio as competition. It would only be later they would come to understand the radio is actually advertisement, not competition. So record labels did not let their music be played on the radio. So there was limited music on the radio. It would be music shows, and it would not be, one recording by Bing Crosby or somebody. It would be a band playing whatever the hot music of the day was for your market. And that means it sounded different everywhere it was played, of course. Speaking of celebrities, just thinking about the recording industry, by the end of the 1920s, there's 100 million records being sold a year. The biggest seller is that man there in the middle, the opera singer Enrico Caruso. But film has made Charlie Chaplin a massive star and a household name. Sports have made Babe Ruth and the boxer Jack Dempsey household names. But the biggest celebrity of all was Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was a mail pilot. He flew for the U.S. Mail. There was a prize for whoever could fly across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop for the first time. And there were all sorts of super equipped planes and expert aviators trying to get this prize. And Lindbergh asked his boss if he could borrow the plane for a weekend. It's called the Spirit of St. Louis. Flew out to New York, across the ocean. And nobody really knows how he did it. I mean, obviously he, took off and flew east. But he had nothing to navigate by, just the stars, and it was apparently cloudy. He was by himself. I believe it took around 30 hours or so. It's really kind of a miracle. This made him the most famous and popular man in America. We'll talk more about Lindbergh as we go along. We're not done with him yet. Consumption led Americans to start considering standard of living to be their highest value. This displaces freedoms like political participation, for example, whereas the ability to have access to all this stuff becomes what's important. And of course, to finance this, Americans slip deeper and deeper into debt. Lincoln Steffens, the muckraker who wrote about the corruption in the cities, said big business in America is producing what the socialists held up as their goal: food, shelter, and clothing for all. But of course, it was unequally distributed. From 1922 to 1929, real wages go up 25%, but corporate profits go up 50%. Increasingly, industries are taken over by oligopolies. Most industries were controlled by 1 to 4, maybe major corporations, like cars, for example. 1% of banks control half of the assets, and the top 3 car companies create 80% of the autos. The top 5% of Americans have more wealth than the bottom 60%. 40% of Americans live in poverty. The majority of Americans have no savings at all. Mass production means fewer workers are needed, which means there's fewer people to buy the stuff because fewer people are getting paid. Manufacturing labor actually falls 5% in this period. But there are more professionals, more people working in retail, finance, and education. Ads are targeted at businessmen and the middle class. Manufacturing begins to move to the South where the labor is cheaper because there are lower levels of education, and unemployment is soon high in the Northeast. By the time of the stock market crash in 1929, only 1 in 4 Americans had a washing machine, for example.